Kelsey Bolar, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Kelsey, you've been involved in this, you're producing this identity crisis series, which is incredibly interesting to me. And you just gave a speech about, all these different institutions, essentially, I mean, in your words, betraying these young people. So tell me what's going on.
Absolutely. Families are being devastated by gender ideology. This is a movement that is branded in compassion and tolerance, but what it's actually doing is tearing families apart. In one case, in a story that I told about a mother from Chicago named Jeanette Cooper, she lost custody of her child, who she previously had custody of 7 nights, 6 days a week, simply for insisting that her child is a girl, that her daughter is a girl. She lost custody. She lives 10 minutes down the street. She no longer can see her. The only way she can communicate with her is by postal mail. In her own words, people who are in prison have more communication with their child than I do. So that's a pretty extreme example, but it is an important example of gender ideology being weaponized against parents to the point where physically separating a mother from the child that she loves. In many other instances, I've spoken with parents who say schools are, quote unquote, affirming children behind their backs in secret when they go to school. So they send their daughter into school, calling her a girl, using her real name. That daughter arrives to school, the doors close, and educators begin treating her as a boy using male pronouns and a made-up name. When they communicate with the child's parents, in some cases, they're using the daughter's real name, so they're essentially lying to parents. And this is an area where I hope that people on all sides of this issue can agree that none of this should be happening in secret behind parents' back. Parents should have a right to know what happens to their child when they send them to school. And another major issue we're facing is that this phenomena involves a lot of young girls with pretty serious underlying mental health issues. Autism, ADD, anxiety, depression, eating disorders. And so parents bring their daughters to therapists, and instead of treating those pretty serious mental illnesses, the therapist uses the child's gender confusion as a coverall and essentially is saying, if your parents start calling you a boy, all of this will go away, your problems will be solved, when in reality, these mothers are saying it's making their daughters far worse. It's actually sending them down a very dark path of depression, serious mental illness, and even mental breakdowns. And in all these cases, these children are not expressing gender confusion when they're young. It is coming out of nowhere. It is clearly a social contagion, which critics will say is not real. But in another case, this mom in Alaska said on her little cul-de-sac with 8 houses, 2 girls on the street identify as transgender, 10 in their local public school identify as transgender. Suddenly, out of nowhere, her daughter also declares that she's transgender. So, children are being betrayed by all these adults, authoritative figures. Children are being manipulated and even mutilating their bodies over this. It is a grave injustice, and it needs to be corrected.
Let's go back to the very beginning and talk about Jeanette Cooper and that basically mom that has been denied access to her child, right?
So her daughter went on a regular custodial visit to her father's house one day. And when Jeanette went to pick up her daughter claimed she felt unsafe. She was trans, and she didn't want to come home. This came out of nowhere. Jeanette did not ever see signs of gender confusion with her daughter. And essentially from there, in an attempt to save this child from her gender confusion, from the pain and discomfort that her mother might cause for simply insisting that she's a girl, a family court decided it is best for the mother to not see her child. They conducted a 7-month investigation into both of the parents, because when a child claims she feels unsafe, that is the court's obligation to do. The court, according to the final parenting agreement that I reviewed, found no evidence of abuse or neglect on behalf of her mother, but maintained that Jeanette Cooper does not have an understanding of her child's transgender identity. And what Jeanette Cooper will tell you is that she has an understanding of a transgender identity, but it's not the understanding that the court wants her to have. In refusing to lie to her child about her sex, because that is her duty as a parent, it is not to confuse her daughter, it is to tell the truth.
And so, this is, of course, a family being broken up as well. And so, who is the child with now?
The child is with her father and her new stepmother. And on this case, I want to point out that no parent should be put in the situation of having to choose between lying to their child and spending time with their child. This mother loves her daughter to no end, unconditional. It's not like she's actually a lifelong Democrat. She considers herself a radical feminist. But on this issue, she simply doesn't want to lie to her daughter, and she believes that she would actually be causing her daughter harm by lying to her that it's possible to be a different sex.
This is the issue we're talking about here is gender dysphoria, right? Potentially.
What's interesting about that is gender dysphoria is a medical term, medical condition that's been around for a long time. The vast majority of young girls going through this right now, they haven't actually been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And in this case, to the mother's knowledge, Jeanette Cooper, she's never been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. That's why I often call it gender confusion. That's why I called my series Identity Crisis, because in many, many cases, it is simply just often young girls. Of course, this is happening with boys too, but it's a phenomenon among young girls exploring their identity, which is a completely normal thing to do. You try on different identities. Who didn't do that when they're younger? The difference about what's happening now is we have authoritative figures actually pushing children down the path, lying to them, saying you can be something other than your biological sex. And the reason why there is so much concern and outrage over this is because these authoritative figures are putting children on the path of lifelong medical harms, manipulating their bodies, irreversible surgeries. So there's a huge medical issue here that, of course, any parent is going to be concerned about. Critics will say social contagion isn't real, that these kids are truly transgender. What's interesting is, I guess they just think it's a coincidence that after never showing signs of gender confusion, a young girl who moves to Alaska, who just happens to live on a block with multiple girls identifying as transgender and then happens to go to school with even more girls identifying transgender, decides she too is transgender. We are supposed to believe that it's just a coincidence. This is clearly not a coincidence. This is a man-made issue that's arising. And again, anyone who has been through middle school and high school knows about peer influence. And the thing that we have to realize is this is normal. It should be okay for young boys and girls to be exploring their identities, to be trying on different things. But by lying to children that they can actually change their biological sex, we are putting them on a path of medicalization and enabling them to cause lifelong harms to their bodies.
Well, Kelsey Bolar, it's such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.